Welcome to Washburn University. My name is Austin Way, and I'm the professor of bassoon here at Washburn. Today we're going to be talking about the two district and state audition excerpts for this year's rotation that come from us from the Furling Etude book. The first one is going to be a slow excerpt, and then the second one is a fast technical excerpt. We're going to get into some different categories on each one. So starting out with the first one, we're going to look at the slow excerpt. I have three categories that I want to get into with this. The first one is going to be security, the second one is dynamics, and the third is expression. So for security, I want to talk a little bit about what I mean by that term security. I use this term with my students a lot, and it basically just means feeling like you're in control of the instrument, like it's consistent, it's reliable, and in a sense predictable as well. So the way we're going to divide that out is we're going to look at three different factors from playing. We're going to look at the embouchure, the articulation, and the air. And where I want to start with this is the very first note. So this first D in the staff is kind of a finicky note on a lot of bassoons, or a lot of reeds as well. It's often, it runs sharp, it doesn't want to speak, it's not as responsive as the notes above or below it. So I'm going to show you a little practice device that I use a lot and I have my students do that can help you just increase your consistency and reliability on this note. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to turn on my metronome. So this is 8th note at 72, by the way. I want to kind of reiterate that. It's a very, very slow tempo here, not a quarter note pulse. I'm going to turn it on and I'm going to let it run and I'm going to turn this first pickup bar into a full 4/4 bar. So I'm going to add 3 extra big quarter note beats. I'm going to add 3 short, very clear, articulate Ds in front of it. And the reason they're going to be so short is because I really just want to focus on the attack of the note, because the main goal with this is to increase consistency on that first attack. So I know what I need to do with my air, embouchure, and articulation to make it speak. So I'm going to turn on my metronome here. And I'm going to add a few practice notes and diagnose what needs to happen before I go on into the whole thing. So what you might find as you go through this, you might go to play the first note, and the practice note might do this. And it kind of sneaks out. It's not in sync with the metronome. It might not speak at all. It might come out sharp. It might come out flat. The idea of these practice notes is it gives you an opportunity to adjust. And by the time you arrive on the first printed note, you're where you want to be. You've made those adjustments. And by doing so, you're building it into your muscle memory so that you can just get a little closer from the beginning each time. And the goal with this exercise is, of course, to eventually just eliminate these practice notes. And then eventually, your muscle memory will let you know right where you need to go right from the beginning, so you don't need to use any of these tools. Another place where this can be useful, because there are a couple of these kind of tricky attacks in this excerpt, is going into measure 9, coming out of measure 8. We have this really strong arrival that lasts for a really long time. We stay loud, we stay forte for quite a bit of time, and then we have to taper down, and then there's this kind of delicate moment where we have to come out of silence into this A attack. So just adding a few of those attacks into the middle of that, you can integrate it inside the excerpt as well. So the next category I want to talk about is dynamics. So this one has a lot of dynamic contrast built into it, which is great because it's so slow and there's not always a lot of rhythmic activity going on. So this dynamic contrast gives us something really useful to work with to keep it musical and interesting and keep it engaging for the listener. So what I want to point out with this, first of all, is we start piano, but it's never marked down to pianissimo. It does decrescendo out of piano, but I point this out because it's really easy to get a really overly wispy or kind of breathy sound on the piano. And I would encourage you to get your dynamic contrast here by pushing up on the fortes so that you're getting really strong louds to contrast these really flowing melodic pianos rather than sort of wispy background sort of sounds. It should always sound very soloistic. And so one thing that I want to point out as well is we have 2 different types of dynamic contrast that are built into this etude. So I'm going to categorize those in 2 ways. We have gradual dynamic contrast and we have abrupt dynamic contrast. And they're going to handle a little differently depending on what we're trying to do. And they're going to create very different effects as well. So the first place I want to point out, we're going to come out of after the breath mark starting in measure 4, and we're going to go to the downbeat of measure 6. And so this is a gradual instance, the reason being that we have this crescendo coming out of it. So we get to build up and get gradually louder, tapering from piano and building up to forte. So what I would encourage you to do with this, because we are at such a slow tempo, is to really take your time as you do this. It's really easy to peak on this B flat, right on the downbeat of bar 5. But you want to think about doing really very little crescendo on these 16th notes because they're rhythmically very active, and therefore there's going to be a level of interest that comes with that. However, the B flat we can develop in different ways, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. But I would put it off until the A trill for the most part. We can do some on the B flat, it does need it. But when you put it off all the way to the end, you can really grow at the last second, and it makes it sound like we're going so much farther than we actually are. This is a really useful woodwind trick because we just don't have the same dynamic range as a lot of other instruments. So we can really build up our sound by really delaying this crescendo. So I'm going to demonstrate that for you. So again, this is the breath mark after the F sharp, starting right on that D, going to the downbeat of measure 6. And then a point about this I want to really emphasize: when you land on this forte, on this E flat, after the breath mark that follows it, stay strong through that whole thing. You want to reserve a little because we have to crescendo going into bar 8, but you want to keep that volume up. So that's where you're going to get that really clear difference between sustained soft and sustained loud. So the other kind that I want to point out is that we're going to talk about abrupt dynamic contrast. This is very useful because this is where we can really bring the listener back in. We can really create some really interesting, surprising moments in our music. So the spot I'm going to isolate for this, we're going to be looking at measure 10 going into 11, so starting on the F sharp and 10, and I'm just going to play the first few notes of 11. So this is starting in piano and then decrescendoing even farther. So this, in theory, is probably the softest spot of the entire excerpt. And then we come abruptly on the downbeat of 11 with this forte E. So I'm going to play this 2 ways. And I want you to notice the difference of effect with this. The first time I play it, I'm going to soften the attack of this E a little bit. So it's not going to be as abrupt. I'm going to kind of taper out this transition a hair, and I'm going to sneak into the E so that it's not as surprising. The second time, I'm going to hit the E really hard right off the bat, so it's going to be as much of a difference as possible. So here's the first option where I'm going to soften out the transition. So it's a noticeable dynamic difference, but I'm going to add 1 layer to it and make it now much more abrupt. So it's a little more shocking that way. It's much more surprising. And one thing that's useful when you hear it in context, we're soft for a couple of bars at that point and getting even softer. So when we come in really strong, right on the attack, it really sticks it out. And also one thing that I think is useful, since this is for an audition, we of course always want to be engaging our listeners as much as possible, but when we're taking an audition, we want to stand out as much as possible. And it's really easy for audition committees to have trouble focusing if you're listening to a ton of people auditioning. So something like this can make you stand out just a little bit more against the other people auditioning. If you're having these moments where you're setting up an expectation and then going a totally different direction, that can be a really exciting thing to listen if you've heard everyone else before you play it exactly the same way. All right, so the third category that I want to talk about for this first excerpt is expression. So this is, I think, the most important thing to focus on as we're getting into this because, again, it's slow, it's rhythmically often not very active, and so we have to add a lot of layers of creativity on our own, and we have to take everything that's on the page and just maximize it. So we've talked about dynamics, and we've talked about the articulation and these different tools. And now I'm going to talk about 2 more things we can use to add some interest to the less rhythmically active spots in this excerpt. The first one I want to talk about is vibrato. I know this can be a little bit contentious for a lot of bassoonists. I have a lot of students that have switched from clarinet, where we traditionally don't use vibrato on clarinet. I've had students switch from saxophone, where you use jaw vibrato, which we do not use jaw vibrato on bassoon. The effect is too strong, so we don't use that. Just a little quick side note on essentially how we do produce vibrato on the bassoon. It's generally, people say it comes from the diaphragm. Some people say it comes from the throat. the realistic answer is it probably is a combination of the two. But the most important thing to keep in mind with it is that you're able to turn it on and turn it off. And really, if we're just looking at it, it's just pulsing the air up and then back down to pitch. And you just want to look at it in terms of how wide it is and how fast it is. And really, those are the only components. And they'll have different effects, and I'm going to talk about how they can impact the music in a couple of different ways so that you can really add some layers of color onto what we're doing. So the first thing I'm going to look at is this very first half note in bar 1. It's very inactive right off the bat. We're picking up, we have a little movement coming in to the downbeat, and then just immediately sitting on this long note for quite a while. And so how do we keep this musically moving forward and musically engaging? And I think using a certain trick with the vibrato is the best way to go. One thing that we can do is start the vibrato very slowly and then warm it up. So what it's gonna do is it's gonna develop the note, it's gonna become more intense and keep the note moving forward and keep it engaging. A good way to practice that is just to isolate that B flat and just warm up the B flat with a little vibrato as you go along. So you can do something just like this very simply. So you can hear I'm just kind of revving it up a little bit as it goes along. So that it's just getting a little warmer, a little more intense as it goes, and it moves the phrase. And also a nice thing with this kind of a vibrato effect is we can do this in lieu of a crescendo. So right here, we're trying to keep it soft, we're trying to stay piano and keep it down so we can maintain that dynamic contrast. And this is just a tool that we can use so that it moves forward without getting louder. That said, sometimes we want the vibrato to be there right away. So a good example of where you might want to have the vibrato really strong right off the bat is going to be the downbeat of measure 6. The main reason for that being is, since we talked about that crescendo leads us up to that E flat, it's a big arrival. So you want to make it sound like you've landed on something. And so by having the vibrato going right away, it's going to sound much more established right off the bat. So likewise, there's another little trick we have in here that's going to function in a very similar way to the vibrato, which is the trills. And so I hear a lot of people with these trills that happen in bars 1 and 5, just want to start them really quickly right off the bat. But again, these half notes are very long. We have a lot of time to develop, and we need to fill the space and keep it going. So in this case, I would recommend doing a very similar thing to warming up the vibrato. You can warm up the trills. So in this case, doing something like this. So you start slow, emphasize the printed note, then just really warm into it gradually. So what I want to do is I want to demonstrate the first bar and a half or so 2 ways. What I'm going to do first is I'm not going to use any of the tools I just talked about, so you can hear what happens if we're just playing it very plainly on the page. And then I'm going to integrate these tools so you can hear the contrast and what it adds and what kind of layer we can get from that. So this is the plain version. And now I'm going to add some vibrato gradually. I'm going to rev up the trill, give it a little more direction. That way the half notes are always going somewhere. It all needs to move forward or be coming away from something, but there always has to be that direction. This is all melodic in this case. All right, so continuing on to the second excerpt. So I've intentionally spent most of my time talking about the first excerpt because it's musically much more complicated than the second one. The second excerpt, it's very technically active and it takes a lot of finger-tongue coordination, but it's not as complicated to talk about because it's essentially something that we just need to spend time with, practicing and getting comfortable with it, and there's not really as much interpretive to get into on that side. So I just have a couple of topics that I want to cover with this. The first one I think is the most obvious one that most people think of when they look at this on the page, which is tonguing. So there's a lot of re-articulated notes, there's a lot of moving notes in this, and so there are a couple different challenges that come in from the tonguing. And the main thing that really comes up first is just figuring out what tonguing speed you can handle. And what I always have my students do to diagnose that, to figure out what you're capable of right off the bat, is just to articulate a measure in 4/4 of 16th notes against the metronome. And I like to do a measure plus one more note, so I'll actually be playing 17th, 16th notes just now. And you want to start at a comfortable tempo just to kind of figure out what's a really manageable, in control tempo, and then you'll just build it up and figure out where you get to a point where you kind of go out of control a little bit. So for now, just to demonstrate, I'm just going to turn the metronome to 80, and I'm just going to play this just so you can hear what this exercise sounds like. So I'm just coordinating with the metronome just to see if I can go faster, if I need to go slower, if I'm in control of it. Since that's a very comfortable tempo, for me, I'd want to move up probably in increments of about 10. If it's not very comfortable, you might want to move up in 5 or fewer. But the idea is you want to find the maximum tempo you're in control of, and then you want to go a little bit beyond that so you can start pushing, but you don't want to be practicing too much out of your control because then you can form bad habits in that area. So by using this as a tool to just figure out where you are, you can also use it as a device that's going to help you build up that muscle in your tongue, and then your tonguing speed will, over time, will increase just by practicing it. So it's something that I would encourage you to figure out where you are and then set goals so you can start to move up to it. The way I recommend exercising tonguing speed is you want to find your maximum tempo and live at that until your tongue wears out, just repeating that exercise several times over and over, and then go past that a little bit, because you want to be exercising where the tongue is a little fatigued, because then that's where the muscle is going to rebuild a little stronger when it comes back. So with this, the tonguing comes up in essentially 2 ways in this excerpt. Again, there's repeated notes and there's moving passages. So I'm going to talk about both of them differently because they present slightly different problems. One thing that I want to say about the repeated notes, there's a nice trick that works for some people, it doesn't always work for everybody, but if you move your tongue from side to side as you're articulating the reed instead of just hitting it dead on every time, for some people that loosens up the tongue and immediately will speed up your tonguing speed. But this is very hard to coordinate in moving passages, so in this case I would recommend it maybe in measure 1 or measure 9, places where we have a lot of rearticulated notes of the same note class. So one thing that I like to do with this, because there's all these accents in here and it's really easy for the dynamic scheme to get a little bit off in this second excerpt, I think a good way to practice it is to first practice taking out the accents altogether. The reason being is here in this excerpt, we're forte the whole time. This is not like the last one where we have a lot of contrast to work with. The whole thing needs to be strong, it needs to be articulated, and forte forever. So what I'm going to recommend, and what I'm going to demonstrate in just a sec, is take the accents out for a little bit and establish your baseline dynamic so you know where you're going to be, and then once you get that forte, articulate, clear sound going, then you can build the accents back on top of that. So just as a good starting point, you can do something along the lines of this. And then over time, once you get comfortable with having that where you can control it, the notes are speaking, they're clear, they're strong, then you can add that, again, on top of that. The fortes need to be even stronger on those accented notes so you can exceed that. Another thing I want to point out is the other type of articulation we have in here is moving notes. And so this poses a bit of a different challenge because now it's not just our tonguing speed, it's coordinating tongues and fingers as well. So one thing that I think is really helpful is just by finding anchor points within these moving passages so we have notes to latch onto. The trick with this is basically so we're not looking at so large of groups of notes at a time. So for example, I'm going to be looking in measures 5 and 6 for this. These descending passages, it's too much to think of as just one thing. I think it's nice to kind of break it up in our minds. So what I would recommend here is break it up on the beat. So we're going to anchor on beat 4 in this case. It's a stronger beat, and a big perk that's going to come with that is it's going to help define the contour of this line, because if we're not thinking about the quarter note pulse or the strong pulse throughout passages like this, they can get really murky really easily, and they can lose their definition pretty fast. So I'd recommend that there, and then additionally a slightly different exercise that I'd recommend in measure 8, where we have this kind of jumpy line that comes in. I would recommend coming at this from odd numbers. So what I mean by that is what I'm going to do first is just do groups of 3. Now I'm going to do groups of 5. The reason I'm doing odd numbers is you're always overlapping a little bit. Why that's important is because we're always practicing getting into notes and getting out of notes instead of if we were to do. In that case, I'm never practicing getting the second note to the third note in a group of 4/16 notes. And so we're really only halfway practicing it. So those odd numbers will help clear up every interval that's going to come up in this. So I think the main thing to keep in mind with this excerpt as you're preparing it is it's marked quite fast. It's marked quarter note at 120. But if I was on an audition committee listening to this, and if I heard someone play it at 120, but it sounded kind of messy, kind of muddy, and I heard someone play it at 100, and it was perfectly clear and clean and articulate, I'm always going to vote in favor of the person that sounds very in control of their instrument. And another thing to keep in mind with something that's a lot of tonguing is you want to know your acoustic, because I'm in a pretty live space right now, so I don't think I would perform this at 120 because it's going to be too muddy. It's just going to echo too much, and I'm not going to be able to hear every note with great precision. So for that reason, you want to be kind of judicious about how you approach your tempo, but most importantly, make sure you're always in control of this one. So thank you everyone for watching. Once again, my name is Austin Way. I'm the professor of bassoon here at Washburn University. Thank you for your time. And for those of you that are going to audition or are planning to audition with this, I wish you the best of luck in your practice and your audition, and I hope you have a lot of fun preparing these excerpts.